Hey, what's happening, everybody? I know a long time no see, right? Yeah, life happens. I took a break from doing this, but I'm back and I'm going to try to remain as consistent as I can. Sorry for missing about a month of these, but life happens. Time to get back on the horse. So, one of the things I want to talk about that's been kind of bugging me over this last month that I haven't done videos is talking about genetically modified foods. I don't really see a lot of information about this. A lot of people just simply mention it in passing or sort of glance over it, or at least talk about like non-genetically modified foods. But I don't think that people realize how much prevalence this has day to day, especially in our food supply. So I want to talk about what it is, why it exists, what you should do if you want to avoid it, and ultimately just give you a little bit of better awareness so that you can make more educated food choices. Just kind of on a side note, like, these videos aren't intended to create any sort of eating disorders or fear about food. It's merely intended to educate and keep you aware of what's going in your body, as opposed to just like, oh, this tastes good, or I like to delve a little bit deeper than simply talking about macronutrients and everything like that. So I'm kind of a bit of a nerd. So come along the nerd ride with me. Let's talk about it. So first, what is genetically modified food? And pretty simply, it's chemists or botanists, biologists, however you want to phrase it. Again, I'm not super familiar exactly with how they do it, but essentially plants are crossbred with other plants that have favorable properties to either defending against pests or being more resilient against weather, or even in certain cases, being able to withstand proper herbicides. So a lot of these companies will do this not out of malice or out of trying to harm people, but more so out of proper business practices. I mean, looking at a spreadsheet or a balance sheet and realizing that you can increase your yields by 40%, give or take, whatever number it may be, by using a specific product, I think makes a big bit of sense business-wise. And so this is why companies will do this. Now, there are some foods that aren't necessarily as prevalent in everyday diet for most people that are typically considered to be GMO foods: alfalfa, sugar beets, canola, albeit there is a lot more canola oil in people's diet than you may realize. But again, I don't know off the top of my head exactly how much of an effect genetic modification has on the properties of canola oil specifically, although seed oils and everything like that will certainly be a topic for a different video. But this video, I want to touch on three specific foods. I want to talk about genetically modified soy, corn, and potato, since for a lot of people, omnivores or plant-based, either way, those are going to be pretty big parts of your diet. And so I think it's important to understand what those are and to understand how to make better choices. So I think one of the first points to make, regardless of genetic modification status or not, corn, soy, and potatoes, amongst other foods, all have a particularly high count of what's called lectins. Lectins are a protein that are built into a lot of plants, albeit more so in their seeds and skins than the general edible flesh of the plant. But these proteins are a built-in defense mechanism for these plants against pests. In other words, if you think about what a lot of the social media influencers, particularly Paul Saladino, talk about, and he's right with this, but basically he says that while animals have the ability to defend themselves physically by fight or flight, plants don't move. Plants can't move. And so their only way of defending themselves from being consumed and killed is through chemical means. And this is one way of many that plants choose to do so. And what these proteins will do is they will disrupt digestive systems of smaller animals to the point where they can't eat, and it will kill them. Now, again, I'm no biologist. I'm just a guy on the internet that wears tank tops. But clearly there is some communication amongst animal and insect species that eat these plants, because eventually they find out that these plants aren't edible and they stop doing it. And so these plants are able to survive and thrive and multiply as nature intended. So they do have these plant proteins in them, and although they can, yes, kill animals, particularly insects, and deter them from eating them. Don't think just because it can kill an insect because they're so much smaller, don't think it doesn't affect you. In fact, these actually have a pretty pronounced effect on your gut health. In other words, they actually open up the gut lining and break the intestinal barrier, causing intestinal leakage into your bloodstream. Amongst other things, it will create systemic inflammation, and actually, in certain cases, depending on your level of sensitivity, can create autoimmune condition. Now, the other end of this that's interesting is that as these plants have evolved, humans have co-evolved with them. And so depending on many factors, not the least of which is ancestry or genetic resilience, any number of things, but primarily ancestry and where your history comes from, that you can actually have a developed resistance to a lot of these lectins. For example, cultures that use potatoes in their diet, like Russians or Northern Europeans, these kind of cultures have clearly developed resistance to these lectins. Therefore, they can use them as primary food sources. So because of that, you can clearly see an evolutionary consistency with these foods as they've evolved with you, and therefore can be eaten in certain situations. Now, granted, if your genetic history hasn't co-evolved with a lot of these things, you might notice you're a bit more sensitive to some of these foods. You might notice that if you eat potatoes, maybe your stomach doesn't feel as great. Or other members of the nightshade family, tomatoes, eggplant, bell peppers, things like that. Maybe if you eat too many jalapenos, your stomach hurts more so than, say, somebody from Central or South America. So it's an interesting concept that is good to think about, but at the same time, it's important to understand that there is a certain amount of coevolution. However, with certain elements of coevolution, with genetic modification, they go completely out the window. In other words, these methods of food production and food cultivation have only existed for, at best, half a century. And because of that, nobody on Earth has evolved to be able to handle this change in structure of food. Therefore, one of the reasons why we're seeing such a rise in so many of these chronic inflammatory or neurological conditions as a result of our food supply being filled with these. I mean, for example, growing up, I know that potatoes were a significant part of my diet. And I know that for most Americans, potatoes tend to be a very significant and important part of their diet. They're pretty decently high in carbohydrates, decent in fiber, very readily available, and have sort of become a cultural staple over generations. However, potato producers noticed that crops could have a better yield simply by crossbreeding them and creating a new version of a potato, essentially. So what they've done is they've crossbreeded potatoes with another plant to add a lectin to them to make them even more resilient to certain pests in the crop. And this lectin is called Galanthus nivalis. And what this does is it disrupts tremendously a particularly difficult to deal with pest in the potato crop world, oddly enough, called the Colorado potato beetle, which is specifically designed to combat against. And so what it does is it disrupts the beetle's digestion, not allowing it to eat, and therefore it dies. And so it deters a lot of these pests from eating it. But if it's able to do that to a beetle, what do you think it's going to do to you? I don't think it's going to kill you, and it's certainly not going to stop you from eating. But what if it creates systemic chronic inflammation? What if it puts you into a state where your immune system is constantly reacting to foreign bodies in your body, therefore not letting yourself be as optimal as could be? What if maybe your joints hurt more? What if you're getting sick more? What if you're depressed or anxious a lot more than you should simply because you're eating a lot of, for lack of a better term, cheap potatoes? Now, genetically modified soy and corn are a bit different because they're not necessarily modified, although some are, but they're not modified to add additional lectins. However, these foods are generally high in lectins anyway, soy in particular. The problem with these foods is that they're genetically modified to be resistant. Well, I should say, okay, so the problem with soy, for example, is that it's modified to be resistant to Roundup. And Roundup is a very effective herbicide that works along a similar pathway in plants as it does to humans to disrupt your gut microbiome and kill off a lot of good bacteria, therefore leading to a good amount of inflammation and problems digestive-wise. And so I think soy in particular is a particularly pervasive problem because you have a two-sided attack from natural lectins in soy, deterring pests, and also the fact that these products are much more likely to contain a significant amount of glyphosate. Now, genetically modified corn, aside from, again, containing a high amount of lectins in and of itself, regardless of its genetic modification status, is now modified genetically to produce what's called a Bt toxin to ward off certain pests. And again, this toxin, although technically not being a lectin, acts in a similar way. It will disrupt the gut lining of these specific pests. In this case, the European corn borer is the main one that they're targeting with it. But they use this to actually have the corn produce it itself so that it disrupts the gut lining of these pests, and then they therefore can't eat it and die. Although it will not kill you by having a little bit of corn, these do have a similar effect in your body as well. It will disrupt your digestion. It will open the gut lining. It will send lipopolysaccharides into your bloodstream, causing systemic inflammation. And depending on, like I said, the level of severity of sensitivity, you may experience autoimmune diseases as well. You may experience depression and anxiety. I think that there is a fair amount of evidence that shows that a good chunk of depression and anxiety that aren't caused by life circumstance are often as a result of chronic inflammation. Now, personally, I'm not a huge fan of having corn in your diet anyways. I think that as a grain, with its lectin content, with its high phytic acid content, I think it actually poses a disaster from a micronutrient absorbent. I think it poses a bit of a disaster from I think it poses a bit of a disaster from a micronutrient absorption deficiency. I got it. I did it. And so I think corn really shouldn't be used much, aside from maybe a certain bit of a treat. Or if you are going to have corn in your diet, I would at least suggest to find organic corn that is sprouted. Sprouting will reduce a lot of the phytic acid. Fermentation is another thing as well. If you can find fermented corn, which I don't even know if that exists. But fermentation tends to lessen the lectin content as well. So if you're going to have corn, I think corn needs to be respected, and I think you need to have certain precautions taken if you're going to have corn in your diet on a regular basis. But I think the problem becomes with soy and potatoes. I think these are two foods that, for omnivores or plant-based eaters, I think that these foods are pretty pervasive in most people's diets. I think that they make up a big part, especially soy, in plant eaters' diets. But even potatoes in general are consumed by pretty much everybody. So first, let's talk about potatoes. What's the solution? Well, as far as a couple of things that you can do to make sure any food isn't going to contain genetically modified foods is by looking for the non-GMO label on more higher-end foods. It's a third-party verification system that will verify the lack of genetic modified content in certain foods. And so I think if you're concerned, that's certainly a great way to start. Or for that matter, buying organic. By law, USDA organic foods cannot contain any genetic modification. So in the case of potatoes, I think that's pretty easy. Buy organic potatoes or buy higher end snack foods if that's the route that you're going to go. Again, I don't like to broadcast being scared of any food or completely avoiding it, but I think it's just important to be smart and to enjoy certain things in moderation. So if you're going to have potatoes, buy organic. Or buy more high-end snack foods, and of course enjoy them in moderation. I think if you're looking at a consistent carbohydrate source, I'm a huge fan of sweet potatoes in that aspect. They don't contain any lectins. Cooking sweet potatoes tends to remove the majority of the oxalate content as well. And then I personally eat a lot of purple sweet potatoes because of the high anthocyanin content, the high antioxidant content. And so I think that that's a great source of carbohydrate if you're like a competitive athlete or somebody who's particularly active or somebody that simply doesn't do well on like a low carbohydrate protocol. I think that would be a great way to go as far as potatoes go. But I think just being a little bit more mindful and respectful of the fact that these foods aren't necessarily harmless. However, with soy, I think that that's actually a much bigger issue, particularly for the plant-based community, because so many plant-based eaters use soy as their primary source of protein. It's a complete protein. It's readily available. More restaurants, especially as more restaurants start to cater toward plant-based eaters, they tend to carry that. And I think that simply because of the thought process behind plant-based eating, that a lot of people think soy is this perfect protein, when in reality, it has a backside to it that I don't think is optimal. So if you are going to use soy, there is one thing I would suggest. Like I said earlier in the video, fermentation of any of these foods will significantly reduce the lectin content. So if you're going to use soy as your primary protein source, I would suggest using tempeh instead of tofu. The reason why is because of the fermentation. It will significantly lower the lectin content. Or if you are insistent on using tofu, what I would suggest as a precaution is to pressure cook it first. That will destroy the vast majority of the lectin content. Now, I'll be honest with you, I can't stand tempeh. The texture is weird. The flavor is weird. Tofu is a much more appetizing protein simply because it's more of a blank slate. And although the texture is a bit strange, especially coming from an omnivore, the texture can be a bit unusual, but it is a blank slate when it comes to flavor, and it's also a lot more convenient. If you are a big fan of tofu, or if that's become a part of your routine, what I would suggest is switching from a soy tofu to a hemp tofu. It's not as easy to find, but if you make a deliberate effort, you'll be surprised how easily you can find it. Certain Whole Foods will carry it. I know that you can order it online through Amazon or various other sources, but hemp as a plant is actually pretty interesting. It has good fatty acid content. It's also a complete protein, but hemp seeds don't contain any of the anti-nutrients that a lot of these other foods, including soy, do. Hemp does not have any phytic acid. Hemp does not have any oxalates. Hemp certainly doesn't have any lectins. It's a very interesting plant, both in its macro and micronutrient profile, but also in its existence. It's one of those things that you almost think has kind of been given to us to coexist with us. And so I strongly suggest looking into that, looking into hemp tofu as opposed to soy tofu as your primary protein source if you are plant-based. Well, I hope this video helps. I think it's kind of an interesting concept. If you have any questions or would like any recommendations, please let me know. I'll find a couple of sources for all of these things that I'm talking about, particularly the hemp tofu. I'll list them in the description below. If all of this is too nerdy and you think that this is uninteresting, then let me know in the comments. Just roast the hell out of me. But thanks a lot, guys, for listening. I will talk to you soon.